Hello, and thank you so much for staying on the AM show. Shortly, we'll be going into the papers, but now I would like to cross over to Joshua Asamoah, who is a senior forecaster at the Ghana Meteorological Service, for an idea of what the weather will be like today. Good morning to you, Joshua. What are you picking about today's weather?
Good morning, and good morning to everyone watching us. So for the next 24 hours, just like we had over the weekend, for the past few days, Greater Accra has been quite fair, and we are expecting these similar conditions to be experienced within the next 24 hours. We're just seeing some cloud developments towards the southwestern parts of Ghana. So areas around the western region towards the western of where we're expecting some cloudy conditions this morning. But these clouds will clear as the day progresses, and we'll see sunny conditions and clouds alternating during the next 24 hours. We are actually expecting some thunderstorms over areas in the northern parts of Ghana. So the northeast, upper east, and then parts of the OT regions are expected to get some rain and thunder later this afternoon. And then we'll drift towards the western parts, that's the upper west, Savannah, and then a few areas in the Pono and Pono East regions as well. So today, where we are expecting rainfall are actually areas in the northern parts of the country and some few areas in the southern portion. That's around the Ashanti, Eastern, and few areas in the Volta region. But for us along the coast, there's a very low probability that we'll get any rainfall within the next 24 hours. There will mainly be some slight to moderate rain for the western side, that's the upper, western region, and then few areas in the central region. But for us in Greater Accra, we are expecting mostly fair weather conditions during the next 24 hours.
Thank you very much, Joshua. Joshua Asamoah is a senior forecaster with the Ghana Meteorological Agency, and he's been giving us the forecast of today's weather. I hope you will prepare depending on where you live and what the forecast is. So quickly, let's get into the papers. And, well, as we would expect, on the front page of many, in fact, all of the papers, there's the issue of Ghana's Ghana going to the IMF for a bailout, but it's interesting how the different papers capture that particular story and the angles they take. Well, we've been joined by the Executive Director for the Media Foundation for West Africa, Suleimana Brahima. Good morning to you, and thanks for your time, Suleimana.
Good morning, and thanks for having me.
Do you feel justified? Let me just start. I've seen your tweet in response to the announcement that the government was going to the IMF. You were one of those who mentioned earlier that, well, it looked like we couldn't stop it from happening. But do you feel justified now that we have an official announcement?
Well, as of March 2022, for some of us, the signs were so clear. I think the whole discussions around e-levy and the promises and all the kinds of assurances that were being given by government were clearly assurances to get people convinced about e-levy. But going to the IMF, there was no question about it. It's been delayed, but it's better late than never. And given that the economy had been mismanaged to collapse, there was no way we were not going to seek a bailout. And so it's great that finally we are there with all the consequences that we would face. But it's better than having a situation where at the end of the month, government being unable to pay salaries and then other statutory payments and defaulting on our debts, which would then get us into a terrible situation as a country. So we had no choice. I mean, this was the only available option for us to take, given the fact that the economy had been collapsed.
You just mentioned that one of the reasons that prompted you to make that prediction earlier had to do with mismanagement. But so let's go into the papers and see how the various papers capture Ghana's decision to go to the IMF. The Daily Dispatch has this: NDC went to IMF due to mismanagement. There was no crisis when they did, and that's according to Afenyo Marking. We heard Information Minister Kojo Oppong on the probe yesterday, put out that same impression that, look, we haven't mismanaged the economy. We have been hit by a global crisis, COVID, and the war in Russia and Ukraine. And this is from the ISA director, that is Professor Courty, and he says going to the IMF will restore confidence. The custodian says fallout from global crisis, Ghana, others seek IMF bailout. And I'll come to find out from you this justification also. I mean, we aren't the only people going to the IMF. It's a global crisis. So please, stop making a big fuss about our decision to go back to the IMF. So Daily Guide says over 100 countries run to IMF. So just keep in mind how the custodian and the Daily Guide capture it. The Republic says NPP NDC trade blames over IMF move. Kenneth Japan wants MPP says party can't break the 8 with IMF squad. And the Finder end of 2019 economy not IMF bound. And okay, the Ghanaian Times surprisingly doesn't have anything on its front page about the IMF. And the Daily Statesman says increased global crisis pushes Ghana to IMF. And on the front page of the Daily Graphic, IMF intervention, government upbeat about economic stability. That's according to Information Minister Kojo Nkrumah. So let's start off this way. You mentioned mismanagement. Government says we haven't mismanaged the economy. In fact, we were doing better until we were hit by COVID and the war in Russia and Ukraine. What's your response to that, sir?
Well, there are a few things to be established. Indeed, the world is going through a crisis, and the crisis includes economic crisis. So if you engage people in the US, they will tell you inflation is rising, cost of living is rising, prices of items, including petrol or gas, is rising. You go to the UK, inflation is rising, cost of living is rising, and so on and so forth. So there's no doubt that there is an ongoing global economic crisis. That's so fundamental. And that is something that those who want to be truthful with their populations, with their citizens, governments that wanted to be very responsible and act devoid of arrogance and devoid of, deception, started having those frank conversations right from January. And then when Russia-Ukraine happened, conversations about the impact. If you take Egypt, for example, that imports about 70% of its wheat and other cereals from those two countries. It was clear that there was going to be a significant toll on cost of living, on prices of food, and so on and so forth. What was happening in Ghana was that the government was engaged in grand deception. The government was, as usual, on its PR governance trail in terms of thinking that people can always be deceived, we can manage the minds of people, we should continue to act as though we are, the wisest bunch of people in Ghana. And so when people were talking about the fact that, look, the economy, the way things are going, government may have to seek IMF intervention. When the Speaker of Parliament talked about the fact that information available to him suggests that very soon, if nothing was done, government was not going to be able to pay salaries of public sector workers. The Speaker was lampooned and bashed. And we were told, boldly, that we are an economy, we are a country, a proud country. We are not short-sighted people. We have the resources to manage our affairs. There's no way we will be going to the IMF. And this was in February by the finance minister. Later, the deputy finance minister was so emphatic. There's no way we are going to the IMF. People can do whatever they like. They know how to manage the economy and so on and so forth. So what were they saying? If people who are managing the economy 4 months ago could not predict, could not analyze the thing, and were, so emphatic that, everything is okay, and so on. Is it a case that they were deliberately deceiving the people?
Well, could it also, sorry to interject, but could it also be the case that they were hoping that the e-levy could, help salvage the problem? Because that was...
Again, if that was their hope, then it tells you the fact that we have people who are managing the economy who really perhaps are either unfamiliar with the trends or just don't know what they are doing. Because even for people like us who are not economists, during the conversation of the e-levy, we looked at what had happened in other countries. We looked at what had happened in Uganda, what had happened in Sudan, what had happened in Kenya, in Tanzania, where the governments there thought, well, the economy, the digital economy is booming, and taxing it would be a way of raising significant amounts of money. When they introduced it, it failed. And we did publications about this to indicate that, look, other countries have tried the same model. Even for some of them, they pegged it as low as 1%, later reduced it to 0.5%, but it still didn't work. And therefore, there's no way that in Ghana it will work. So if the managers of our economy were still of the belief that they have the magic to make e-levy or digital taxation work when other countries like Kenya and other places couldn't manage to do it, again, it tells you that perhaps they had no clue about what they are doing. And it points to why we are having such a catastrophic failure, because the people managing the economy cannot analyze what is happening, cannot predict what is going to happen on the basis of either the global trends or our own economic indicators, and only gets us into accidents. I think that what we have now is an accident, because if you have the Minister of Finance, his deputy, and other people telling us there's no way we are going to IMF, and just 3 months or so or less, we are into IMF, then really are these people the competent people to manage our economy? And I doubt. And I'm not surprised that people are calling on the president to fire the finance minister, because this is the same person who said, we are not going to the IMF. And in a matter of months, we are into an IMF program.
So, Mr. Brema, the indication we get, especially with the finance minister and the president's decision that we should go to the IMF, it appears the finance minister is still standing by his decision that we shouldn't go to the IMF. In fact, listening to Kojo Ponkrumah on the probe yesterday, he did mention that the president also receives advice from other experts and speaks to, other people, and he has the ultimate decision on whether we have to go to the IMF or not. Does that worry you? I mean, because once we get the indication that, well, the finance minister is possibly still standing by his decision that we shouldn't go, and the president has made a decision not paying attention to the advice from his finance minister, clearly there appears to be a problem.
No, I think that's just basically a way of trying to redeem the credibility of the finance minister. And in fact, the way the communications came, knowing very well the position of the finance minister just a few months ago, and it pointing to, an indication that the finance minister may not be up to the task. Government had to, manage to salvage his credibility and redeem his credibility. And so let's put it out that it's the president who has, authorized that the Minister for Finance should engage IMF. But if it were the minister alone, he would still stick his earlier position that there was no way we should go to IMF. So quite clearly, the other troubling thing is that we have a government that you just cannot understand who is in charge. We have the vice president who is the head of the economic management team. Throughout e-levy, we didn't hear from him. I was told that the vice president is clearly opposed to the e-levy mechanism, and I believe that it was based on his sound knowledge of how things work and the fact that he's engaging so vigorously on our digitalization agenda. And so you have the vice president not talking. On this IMF conversation, you have the vice president not talking. But if we have a situation where without an IMF bailout, in the next 2 or 3 months, government cannot run the country because we cannot pay salaries of workers, we cannot make statutory payments, we are likely to default on our debts. What options are available? For me, the whole thing about the president authorizing, as I said, is a way of redeeming the credibility of the Minister for Finance, because quite clearly it points to the fact that we have a Minister of Finance who may not really be on top of issues and who may not really know how to manage the economy, because for a Minister of Finance, by 6 months you should know if the way things are going, we should be adopting a new policy, going to the IMF or whatever. But here was a minister telling one story and the indicators pointing to another story. I don't think that the Speaker of Parliament, when he made the point that we are likely not going to be able to pay salaries, he was lying. And he said credible information available to him. And this is the Speaker of Parliament, number 3 in the hierarchy of leadership in this country. And so, again, for me, we have a global crisis. Unfortunately, I don't think that it would have been a big deal going to the IMF, except that previous commentaries and statements by the same government would have betrayed the fact that they are going. But given what is happening in the world today, it wouldn't have been surprising for me, except that the arrogance of this government and the tendency to behave as if they are the wisest bunch of people or group of people, and the tendency to behave as if we can deceive the people forever, the tendency to behave as if PR can do all the things for us as a government is unprecedented. I don't think that we've seen this level of arrogance, this level of deception, this level of PR governance throughout the Fourth Republic. And that is why we are where we are. Otherwise, if people's expectations had been managed, and people understood that, oh, look, Russia, Ukraine, COVID-19, countries are struggling, even the advanced societies, US, the UK, every country is struggling, people would understand. But we have a government that wants to show off, a government that wants to grandstand, a government that wants to deceive, a government that wants to do propaganda all the time and behave as if it's the best thing ever, best thing Ghana ever had. And that is why, they are now struggling, putting ministers all over media houses to speak. I've come across, the communication lines that they want to use, sending it out to, people who will be in the media and so on and so forth. Again, still on the PR thing, instead of accepting that, look, globally, there's a crisis. We are a government. We accept that, look, the time has come for us to do this. And we apologize for all the grandstanding statements that we made, as if we have whatever it is that can take this country from, third world to first world. That, for me, is the problem of the government and the problem that we all have.
Following from what I said earlier about the finance minister and his stance and the president having the ultimate responsibility, and what you just said about the vice president, who is the head of the EMT, do you get a sense that there is no real collaboration in terms of where we want to go as a country and the plan to get us there? Because if what we heard from the information minister is anything to go by, that the finance minister, still says we won't go to the IMF. He still kind of believes in that, but we have different experts advising the president. The president has ultimate responsibility. We've not heard from the vice president. What does that really display? What does that speak of the team which is supposed to be working together to take us to a certain destination?
Well, first of all, it's very unclear to know who is in charge when it comes to the management of our economy. Certainly, Vice President Dr. Mahmoud Bawumia has demonstrated, level of competence or level of knowledge when it comes to the economy. Having served at the Bank of Ghana during the period of redenomination, and people say, well, even the actual redenomination process, Bawumia was somebody who was very key in the process. And if you listen to his analysis of the economy, even though sometimes there's a bit of propaganda here and there, but to be able to even do that shows the level of smartness and his understanding of the economy and how things work. But I think over the period, he's either been sidelined and people are doing what they want to do. For me, I keep saying that if there is one thing I have learned, leadership thing I've learned from the governance of President Akufo-Addo is, how catastrophic it is to surround yourself with family and friends and yes men and yes women. And that is what is happening. I think that sometimes maybe the president himself is not giving the right information, but there are people that he has surrounded himself with who would tell him, Mr. President, everything is okay. Mr. President, we will do it. Mr. President, don't worry, everything is fine. Rather than listen to maybe the vice president who is the head of the economic management team. Because otherwise, I would have loved to see Vice President Bawumia on the front lines indicating how things are going. And I will be shocked and surprised if in the last 4 or 5 months, someone like Dr. Bawumia didn't know that the way things are, IMF bailout is something that is imminent. I would be surprised. But as I said, you just cannot tell who is in charge. We have, for the first time, a government that does no reshuffle. A minister is away from the country for almost a year, still keeps her post. So you really cannot understand who is in charge and whether we are on autopilot or really the president is managing the affairs of the country as he should.
We've heard from the TUC. There are concerns about the conditions this bailout may come with, and they cite the previous one that we went for, where there was a freeze on salary increments, there was a freeze on employment in the public sector. But you don't have a problem with us going to the IMF. In fact, you predicted this, and in your tweet you said that is not the problem. Going to IMF is not our problem. But the TUC is concerned. We don't know yet what the conditions are with regards to this particular program and how it will pan out. But it clearly shows that there definitely is a crisis. The TUC doesn't want it, but it appears we have to go for it. I don't know if you were in the shoes of the TUC in terms of looking at it from a different perspective, the general economy of the country, and what will your advice or compromise will be?
Well, first of all, let me say that going to the IMF is not my preference. Okay. It's just that it was the only option. We had run the economy to the ground to the point where the only option available was to go to the IMF. And so my point was, look, whether e-levy or no e-levy, we would have to go to the IMF. Not because I love us as a country going to the IMF, but that was the only option available. For the TUC and other public sector workers, and yesterday I think I read somewhere that Professor Jampo was saying Ghana will be ungovernable if the IMF conditionality includes freeze on salary,
yes,
and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
But I'm sorry, the reality is that we take it that we are in a family. You have the family head who is supposed to manage the resources of the family so that you don't go borrowing. Because if you go borrowing, the one giving you the money would have certain conditions for you and you have no choice because you need the money. That is the situation that we find ourselves in now. We, as a country, are endowed so much, and that is why Mr. Foriata said we have the resources. And indeed, we have the resources. It's just that the resources have been abused, has been looted, and messed up to the point where, we have to go borrowing. And once we've gotten to the point where we are going to borrow, unfortunately, we, the family members, have no choices to make. The family of the head of family is the one who is going for the borrowing, and we need the borrowing in order to be able to survive. Otherwise, we can't survive. So, going for the money, is it better to go for the money and come and the one who gives us the money says, please keep salaries where they are, or we don't go and at the end of the month we don't get paid at all? This is the situation we find ourselves in. It's either we don't get paid at all and not go to the IMF, or we go to the IMF with all the conditionalities which may include the fact that salaries should be frozen. Because the IMF basically is coming to manage the economy for you, to make sure that things are reset properly. And to do so, salaries may have to be frozen. Maybe unemployment, employment as was done previously, may have to be frozen. For me, the only good thing is that maybe the looting will reduce. Because if we had a responsible, caring, and a government that doesn't want to go to IMF, such a government would not be, dishing out money towards cathedral when they know that this is our economic situation. Such a country or a government will not be parceling out millions of money to private companies in a fictitious fumigation exercise when they know that that exercise will not do anything under COVID. If fumigation could deal with COVID, why? US, China, and others, do we have capacity to fumigate our country better than them? Why were they struggling? Spain, Italy, people died in hundreds, sometimes in thousands a day. Why couldn't they fumigate? But it was an opportunity for people to loot. And so hundreds of millions of cedis were awarded in needless contracts so that people can get money away. This is how our resources have been abused. Companies have made millions of cedis as transaction advisors. Even after COVID, we are still taking loans to Parliament for approval in relation to COVID. So I think this government must accept that it's not the case that we didn't have the resources. It is not because of COVID. It is not because of Russia and Ukraine. It is simply because the economy has been messed up, because our resources have been looted, corruption has been on the high, and people have basically fraudulently abused our resources in such a way that the only way and only option available to us now is to go to the IMF. And once we are going with cap in hand, we cannot dictate what the conditions must be, unfortunately. So TUC and others, we should all be prepared for the consequences.
So for you, even though 100 countries are going to the IMF, just has been captured on the front page of the Daily Guide, you believe that if we have managed our economy better, despite COVID and the war in Russia and Ukraine, we could have been doing better and not even have to go to the IMF at all. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. And if we had time, I could count maybe more than 100 countries around the world who, when they go to the IMF, shouldn't be surprising at all. Why? For example, Burkina Faso, the crisis that they are going through, and the resource deprivation that they are in. If they are going to IMF, why should Ghana be comparing ourselves to Burkina Faso? To Mali, the crisis that they are going through. Niger, where they are, the climatic conditions. How are they even able to grow food that is helps them to be sustainable in terms of food production? You take countries like Haiti, the DRC. There are several countries that you can point to that have been in constant crisis. Guinea-Bissau, and so on. So why are we not saying that there are more than 100 countries that have not gone to the IMF? Why are we not comparing ourselves to those countries, but rather comparing ourselves to those that have run to the IMF? And Ghana is so much endowed. What is it that we don't have? What is it that we don't have? We have the right land, the right environment, the natural resources. Oforiatta himself said it, and the president himself said it. Yet Tisikasun Sukombe. What was the president seeing at that time? And this is somebody who has been in government before. It's not as if President Akufo-Addo has not been in government before. He's been in government before. So when he said Tisikasun Sukombe, what was he referring to? When Ms. Oforiatta said that we have the resources, so we are not going to IMF, what resources was he talking about? Ghana is so much endowed. It is just absolutely mismanagement. And we've gone to the IMF back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And for me, it's all a case of mismanagement. A country that doesn't have and yet wants to live as if we have, all that it takes to live like kings and queens. We have the president still chartering the luxurious, aircraft.
Private jets.
Yes.
So
live like kings.
So right now, we know that we're going to the IMF. The other issue for many people is whether or not we'll be able to effectively execute the program. That's another chapter altogether, and whether, like it's happened in time past, we won't fail. So what would your desire be going into the IMF and seeing that we have done this over time and sometimes we haven't succeeded? What would you hope to see, especially with the attitude of government, like you've mentioned? What changes would you like to see to ensure that this program we are even going for will be a success at the end of the day?
Well, I think the government has to do what it ought to have done to prevent us from going to the IMF in the first place. We don't need this 100 ministers or so to run this country. It is just job for the boys. It is just reward. We don't need to have the levels of corruption that we have had over the period. We don't need the level of looting that we've witnessed over the period. I mean, so far, if the corruption perception index is anything to go by, the current government's best performance has been the worst performance of the previous government. And we all know that I'm not by this saying that the previous government was any better. I think if we have good leadership, this country will be transformed in such a significant way. So we had a government that was a failure, and we have a government that is a failure now. And what it takes is cut down on the expenditure, reduce the levels of ministers that we have, reduce the levels of corruption and looting that we are witnessing. And if we are able to do that, I will get to a point that we don't need these international and Bretton Woods institutions coming in to support us. I think that if we have a good leader, this country will be significantly transformed. We were hoping that President Akufo-Addo will give us that kind of good leadership that we had lacked for long. Unfortunately, he has not been different from all the leaders that we've had, and in some contexts, it's even been worse under him.
So now to the big one that a lot of people have been asking: should we scrap the e-levy now? We know that it's not raking in how much we thought it will. Now we are going to the IMF. Is it necessary to keep the e-levy?
Well, the e-levy was unnecessary from day one. As I said, the amount of money that is looted through government schemes is far more than what Ms. Ofori-Atta was projecting that we would have from e-levy. And so they had the opportunity to ensure that those loopholes are plugged, and all those fictitious contracts and inflated contracts are scrapped so that we can make the money. Now with e-levy, for me, of course, as I said, it's unnecessary. It's something that is going to affect us negatively than positively. But now that we have had no choice but to go to IMF, and IMF coming in to ensure that you are able to manage your economy, I'm sure different taxes will be proposed, and government may have to adhere to them, and all other measures. And under the circumstances, I don't know if it will be the right thing for the government to say, even though we are running to the IMF, the policy that we put in place that is giving us some money, even though not as much as we were anticipating, we want to scrap that. I doubt they would have the courage to be able to do that, because you are going out there to beg and to ask IMF to come and manage the economy for you because you have been poor at managing it. You couldn't manage your own affairs. You are inviting them to come and manage it. I guess this is not the time for you to say, even though I'm coming to you to beg for you to come and manage the economy for me, the measures that I've put in place that is generating some money for me, I'm going to scrap it. I doubt they would have the courage to do that. But e-levy, talking to people, listening to people, is quite clear that it's going to be an impediment to our growth rather than a decision or an action that would support our growth.
Okay, so let's take a breather from the e-levy. The big story on the front page of the Daily Graphic is quite an interesting one. And it says, Ghana needs righteousness, not churches, leaders. That's according to Apostle Eric Nyamiche. And he is the chairman of the Church of Pentecost. And so let me just bring details of the story and take your quick thoughts as we wrap up the news review. He says that what the nation needs are not leaders and churches, but righteousness exhibited by the citizenry through faith. He noted that although there were many churches and leaders in the country, righteous living was still an issue. The chairman added that the change the country sought from its leaders could only materialize through righteous living and building a righteous brand. What are your quick thoughts on this? I don't know. When I just read the story, I couldn't help but think about the National Cathedral. I don't know if the same happened to you, but I mean, I'm just reading this. Ghana needs righteousness, not churches, and instantly my mind goes to the National Cathedral. But let me hear what you think about what he said.
Well, I think I subscribe to the idea that we need righteous people. Righteous people would seek to always do the right thing, would seek to be just, would seek to be fair, and treat those who are underprivileged with the kindness that they deserve. That is something that I subscribe to. But I also believe that righteous people are people that speak truth to power. Righteous people are people who will tell leaders in the face if they are failing or when they are failing. And therefore, I expect people in leadership position in our churches who are speaking like this to be able to also speak to the leadership of the country. That, look, what we need is righteous acts from you. And righteous acts would mean that you wouldn't loot our monies, you wouldn't be corrupt, you wouldn't inflate contracts, and so on and so forth. And I am of the view that people in this country, of course, in terms of moral turpitude, in terms of ethical values, and so on, we are losing it. And we are losing it partly also because leadership from governmental, non-governmental, religious are not showing the kind of examples that would enable people emulate the righteous tendencies that we all want. We have so many churches, we have so many mosques. Why is crime on the rise? Why is corruption on the rise? Why is it that our leaders, whether President Mahama, President Akufo-Addo, all the ministers, Ms. Oforiatta goes to Parliament and always will quote the Bible before starting the presentations and so on and so forth. Why are we where we are? So people just pretend. And I would urge leaders like Apostle Nyamiche and co. to also begin to say the things as they are, rather than, all the yes, we need righteous people. But you should tell the president, the ministers, and the opposition leaders, and all those people that, look, we are not having righteousness in terms of leadership from you, and therefore begin to act the right way. Otherwise, sometimes some of these things, as people will say, beating about the bush and saying the sweet things in the ears, but which will not translate into any meaningful thing for all of us.
Interesting. Thank you so much, Suleiman Ibrahima, for joining us this morning for the news review. Suleiman Ibrahima is Executive Director of the Media Foundation for West Africa, and we've been talking largely on government's decision to go to the IMF for a bailout. He's one of the people who said, look, it will happen, and it has happened. Thank you so much. We appreciate it, and we'll stay in touch with you, Suleiman Ibrahima. Right now on the show, we're going to bring you sports news shortly. Do stay.